Hello and welcome to Stars, Cells, and God, the show where we discuss new discoveries taking place at the frontiers of science that have theological and philosophical implications, as well as new discoveries that point to the reality of God's existence. My name is Hugh Ross. I'm your host for today, and I'll be your guide as we explore. Well, we have what's going to be special. We got David Winyard here, and he's from our scholar community. He's an engineer. And so I'll be interviewing him on some of the research he's been doing. But before we get into the discussion, I wanted to encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Reasons to Believe YouTube channel, and click on the bell icon so you can be informed of our new videos. Learn more at reasons.org or by following us on social media at RTB_official. Well, David, why don't you tell us, I just heard that you got your PhD at the University of Maryland, and can you tell us what you got your PhD in? And I'd also like to know what your thesis topic was.
Sure. I got my undergraduate degree at Maryland, but I got my PhD at Virginia Tech.
Virginia Tech, okay.
And yes, I was trained and worked as an engineer for a long time, but going back to school to get teaching credentials, I ended up in Science and Technology and Society, STS. Mm-hmm. So I went through the STS program at Virginia Tech. And my dissertation ended up examining transhumanism of how Christians of different types should view futuristic technology. Mm-hmm. My goal in going to Virginia Tech was to explore in greater depth the connections between technology and Christian thought. The science, Christianity, and evolution matters seem to suck a lot of the oxygen out of the air, but good. Really affects our lives.
And
more
Virginia
and more.
Tech was open to that?
Yes,
That's
it
good.
was.
Yeah.
It was an interesting experience bringing theology into conversation with sociology and history and philosophy. But my advisor there, Jim Collier, was very encouraging to me and brought to my attention a lot of things that were very close to my heart. So I'm really delighted that I could study there. And
so right now you're teaching?
Yes, and that's the interesting thing too. I ended up accepting an offer to teach engineering, and I never expected to do that. So I'm able to bring matters of science and faith into the classroom as I teach engineering at Grace College, and I'm delighted to be able to do that.
Very good. And your work as an engineer was predominantly in what areas?
I worked for the U.S. government. I worked for a Navy machinery R&D lab, and most of my work there was in hydraulic systems and pumps. So fluid mechanics and machine design was what I did there. And then I switched over to Defense Logistics Agency, totally different culture, totally different mission. And I ended up working on mostly distribution R&D there.
Well, that's where we got a connection. My father was in Montreal when I was born and was running an hydraulics engineering business.
There you go.
So, all right. But you want to talk to us about spacecraft and some of the engineering challenges of spacecraft. And what fascinated me, you picked the two most challenging. So I'm really interested in what you've got to say about how we deal with the thermodynamic challenges of James Webb, and what I think is even more exciting, what about that Parker Solar Probe?
Yes, it's now is a wonderful time to be teaching the thermal fluid sciences and heat transfer because of these two missions that are going on as we speak that are at two different ends of the operating environment. Space vehicles and space has always been interesting to me. I grew up in the 1960s watching the race to the moon, and I really love a video, it's on YouTube, of Failure is Not an Option. It tells the story of mission control, and it really talks about the work of engineers and getting people to the moon and back. I can't watch that without feeling emotion. But the Parker Solar Probe and the James Webb Space Telescope are really fascinating from an engineering, from a heat transfer point of view.
Okay, which one do you want to talk about first?
Well, I think the Parker Solar Probe is the best place to start.
Yeah, that's really challenging.
But both of these missions have very interesting things from the standpoint of dynamics too. That's another course that I teach, and so everybody can understand that things go in orbit, they move around the Earth or the Sun, and that's a really simple two-body problem. But when you add a third body and the gravitational effects of that, you end up with some really strange things. And so both of these missions have really very interesting orbits. That the Parker Solar Probe, of course, goes very close to the Sun, but the orbit has been adjusted a number of times during that mission. It kind of swoops in close to the Sun at very high speeds, and it comes out near the orbit of Venus.
So it's a highly elliptical orbit?
It's a highly elliptical orbit, and they pre-planned encounters with Venus to adjust to that orbit.
So Venus gives it like a gravitational slingshot?
Less a slingshot than a nudge.
A nudge, yeah.
We sent the Parker Solar Probe for its early missions to the Sun, and being a conservative approach, they basically kept it kind of far away from the Sun to begin. But it has, on a number of occasions, come close to Venus, and its orbit has been kind of nudged to go closer and closer and closer to the Sun. So I think the last encounter with Venus will take place, I think, in November, and then the Parker Solar Probe will make its closest approaches to the Sun.
How close are we talking?
Well, I remember the analogy of a yardstick, that if the Sun is 1 yard away from the Earth, the Parker Solar Probe is going within 4 inches of the Sun. Of course, the closer you get, the more intense the environment. It is going so close to the Sun that it is actually passing through the corona. So there's some mass that has been ejected by the Sun, and it's actually traveling through that.
Well, back in 2017, we had a couple of hundred people in Oregon to watch the total solar eclipse. And because it was a very short eclipse, we had a spectacular view of the corona. We could actually see the corona 10 moon diameters away from the Sun. So the corona goes out quite far. People don't realize how far it goes out. But this Parker is actually going to go inside the corona.
Yes. I don't think it did it on some of its early passes, but some of the later passes that have moved it closer to the Sun, it actually has. Of course, it's very, very close to a perfect vacuum. There's not a lot of mass there, but it is extremely hot. And it's really peculiar that the corona is actually hotter than the surface of the Sun. And so the dynamics by which this plasma is heated to such high temperatures is one of the things that the probe is intended to explore.
Yeah, and I remember that originally they were going to try to make a craft that would go even closer to the Sun than Parker, and they scrubbed it because they said it's going to be too expensive to protect it from the heat. But this one's getting within 4 million miles of the Sun, so heat protection is not a trivial issue.
Oh, absolutely. And so, I mean, even from the surface of the Earth to Earth orbit, there's a tremendous increase in the solar radiation there. If you're outside the Earth's atmosphere, the solar radiation is very intense. And then you move that close to the source of all that energy, and it is an amazingly harsh environment. So the Parker Solar Probe heat management system is a marvel of engineering to manage that.
Well, why don't you tell us about this marvel? How did they work it out so that it could actually give us useful information when it's that hot?
Well, I wish I could give you the absolute details, but not working for NASA, I can only know what they've disclosed and what I tell my students. But it has a large reflective heat shield that faces the Sun, and so a large fraction of the radiation is reflected back. A certain amount of it is absorbed by that heat shield, and so it has to be cooled to make sure that it doesn't melt. And then behind that heat shield are all of the instruments, and they have to be protected, kept at very low temperatures, relatively speaking, so that they can do all of the measurements that they want to do.
So how do they cool the shield?
well, first of all, by making sure it's reflective, it doesn't absorb much heat.
Right.
But then there is actually a system that carries by convection that heat away from the heat shield, and it actually uses water as the heat transfer material. So teaching heat transfer, we have conduction, convection, radiation, and so all three of those are involved in the heat management system on this probe. So water carries the heat away from the heat shield, and it carries it to radiators that sit in the shadow of the heat shield. And the only thing they, quote unquote, see is the cold of space.
Right.
And so you have this very hot star, but space is close to absolute zero, and so it makes a tremendous heat sink.
So the trick is circulating the water from
Yes.
hot to cold. And is there any problem with water loss, or are they got it pretty well sealed?
Well, I think it's all sealed. There must be a pump there, because without a gravitational field, there's no tendency toward natural convection. So there must be some kind of pump in the system that moves the fluid around.
And what powers this probe?
Well, it's being close to the sun. Solar energy is.
So solar panels do the
solar
job.
Panels.
Yeah.
But of course, because it moves between the sun and the orbit of Venus, the amount of radiation varies a great deal. So when it's close to the sun, these solar panels and everything else is tucked into the shadow of the heat shield. And there are instruments on board that will tell whether it's misaligned, and it will correct the orientation of the probe. But then I think when it gets out past Venus, the solar panels are more exposed and generates all the power that's required.
Okay, very good. And what is this probe trying to do?
Well, we don't understand many things about our nearest neighbor, star, and so learning the physics of why the corona is so hot, and learning about solar mass ejections and solar storms and things like that do have an effect on us here on Earth. The intensity of the sun is of interest because of issues like global warming. The sun goes through cycles where there are more or less sunspots, and there have been incidents, even recently, where eruptions in the sun have affected satellite communications here, or even ground-based
So
systems.
this probe is basically sampling the electromagnetic radiation in the corona?
It is, and I don't know all that it's doing, since I'm just fascinated by the heat management system.
Well,
all of the other wonders it's doing.
what excites me as an astronomer is that we can't really study the corona of other stars, but we can study the corona of our sun. And so getting all this data from the Parker Solar Probe is not just telling us about the physics of the sun.
Good point.
It's the physics of all these other stars. And so we have a laboratory that's up close to us that gives us a lot of information about stellar astrophysics. So,
well, I'm sure that's a wonderful laboratory for the astronomers and physicists. I was very interested in astronomy going through college. I took a number of electives on it, and I remember being fascinated by binary stars, where you actually have mass passing from one to the other. We don't have that, obviously, in our solar system. Thank
good
goodness.
thing. Yeah.
But the flow of energy and mass in space around a hot star is fascinating. And then, of course, we have these things called black holes and all that, where it's approaching the speed of light, for goodness sakes. We don't simulate that in our fluid mechanics labs.
Well, fascinating, too, about Parker is how fast it goes when it's close to the sun.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. We're not talking 26,000 miles per hour anymore.
Right. We're setting new speed records there.
I think the fastest it goes is like 490 million miles an hour. So,
Oh, gosh.
or 490,000, pardon me.
Okay.
So it's 15 times faster than ships we send to the moon.
Pretty fast.
Yeah.
And it must be interesting to work in the communication with a vehicle that's moving that fast. I know that GPS satellites move fast enough that time moves along at a slower rate simply because of that. And here's a vehicle traveling so much faster than that.
Yeah. Fortunately, we don't have to sweat atomic clocks on it, so as you do in the GPS.
That's right. GPS is interesting. I tell people that you don't deal with relativity very much, but you use GPS, and that works on the basis of this time dilation.
You actually need it correct for the general relativity.
So there's actually a practical use for relativity that rides around in your cell phone.
Right. Well, this is interesting. Tell us about the James Webb Space Telescope.
Oh, gosh.
That's another whole challenge.
That is another.
Here you're trying to keep it cold, right?
That is another challenge on the heat management thing, and it has an interesting orbit too. That again, a two-body problem is pretty easy to consider when you look at celestial mechanics. But the Parker Solar Probe and the James Webb Space Telescope have these interesting orbits because it's a three-body problem. So the farther you are away from the sun, the orbits, circular orbit would get slower and slower.
Well, for the benefit of people who haven't taken all this tensor calculus, a two-body problem, as we've all been taught, can be solved exactly.
Yes.
Three-body, four bodies, no. We can come up with good approximations, but not an exact solution.
Yes. So the three-body problem between the sun and the Earth and the James Webb Space Telescope has been solved in a very, very interesting way. Earth travels around the sun in a year. Jupiter, I guess it's 20 years or something like that. So the James Webb Space Telescope is on a more or less circular orbit farther away from the sun than the Earth. And so under ordinary two-body problem solution would basically say, well, it would be taking more than a year to orbit. So eventually Earth and the telescope would move farther and farther away. But in fact, the Earth's orbit has an effect. And so it's basically sitting 1 million miles or so away from the Earth's surface, and it moves around the sun at the same rate. They have the same angular velocity. And by doing that, they can keep the heat shield between these hot bodies, the sun and the Earth and the moon, and keep that heat from interfering with the instruments on the far side of.
Well, that's good, because a lot of people wondering, why do we put it so far away? And
there's some disadvantages of that. We went up and did a couple repair missions on the Hubble Space Telescope. Well, this is in an inaccessible place. We're not going to be able to do any repair missions for the James Webb Telescope. But it can take measurements in its position that could not be done from Earth orbit.
And it's in a colder spot. You don't have to worry about the heat from the Earth or the heat from the moon.
That's right. And heat is important because the observations it's making are in the infrared region, I believe. And those instruments have to be kept close to absolute zero to work efficiently. So if I remember correctly, the cold side of the James Webb telescope is like 30 Kelvin. The sunny side of it is, if I remember correctly, it's about the point of the boiling point. I think it's like 200 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's at a temperature that we have some familiarity with. But the cold side of it is close to absolute zero and needs to be that way to take all the observations they want.
Well, when it comes to infrared and radio astronomy, the colder you can keep your receiver, the more sensitive your measurements, the better your measurements. So that's always the goal. Let's keep our receiver as cold as possible.
Right.
So, and you want it to be down around 30 degrees Kelvin or less.
Yeah, we've done infrared astronomy. I visited my daughter and her family in Tucson, and at the Pima Air and Space Museum, they have the NASA 747 that did infrared astronomy at high altitudes. So you get above most of the Earth's atmosphere, you can start doing that. But space is the ideal place for that. And this very odd place that the James Webb Telescope is in is even better than that, even though it's inaccessible to us.
Okay, so how do they solve the engineering problems?
Well, again, the challenge is to isolate the instruments from the radiation from the sun and even from the Earth and Moon. And so the James Webb Telescope has a number of radiation shields between the instruments and these heat sources. I think there are 5 layers of reflective material, each one a radiation shield from the layer below it. And by the time you go through all 5 layers, you get down to the temperatures that those instruments need to be at. Radiation is an interesting, just by itself, radiation is an interesting subject. Teaching heat transfer, we start out with conduction and we move on to convection. And both of those many of the applications of those things are really kind of disposal, heat disposal. So we have heat engines and we have coal and gas and oil power plants. And so rejection of heat is done by convection primarily and conduction for Earth-based things. But when you get to radiation, it's much more than waste disposal. The idea that radiation has an information component to it, and we can tell what the materials are in faraway objects. You can't do that with convection and conduction. It's just raw heat, most of the time waste heat. But radiation has a completely different quality.
Well, you brought up the issue of the 5 shields. I get asked the question all the time. Why didn't they just have one shield? Why 5? Why the redundancy? Are they worried about the thing being punctured by micrometeorites? But you basically hinted at the answer. We really need all 5.
If I want to insulate something like your coffee cup here, well, I can add insulation to it. I can just add mass to that. But isolating radiation heat transfer is simply put something opaque between the heat source and what you're trying to insulate to block the flow of the radiation. And each time you put an opaque barrier there, you have a tremendous effect on the heat transfer. So putting multiple layers of opaque materials between the sun and the instruments leads to this very, very low temperature on the cold side.
So you get a tremendous drop from one layer to the next layer and that layer to the next layer.
Right.
And so with 5 layers, you can really keep the craft
That's
as
right.
cold as you need it to be.
The more layers, the better. So sometimes we will build or use dewars of liquid nitrogen or some other cryogenic fluid by putting them in a thermos bottle that has many, many layers to block the radiation.
That's a good analogy.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I remember talking to engineers about this when it was being built, and it's like, why don't we have 10 layers instead of 5? Because,
Right.
I mean, the thing is going to get punctured by micrometeorites, so you need, 5 is optimal, but shouldn't we build more? And their comment was, well, we got to keep the craft light. And, the more stuff the thing that amazed me is that the James Webb, even though it's way bigger than the Hubble Space Telescope, the weight is only half.
Yeah, it's a very large. I remember being compared with the size of like a tennis court. The radiation shields are very large
Right.
for the instrumentation. And this idea of a heat shield is used here on Earth too. We drive around in cars where there may be a hot tailpipe a few inches away from a gas tank, and you don't want the heat transfer to take place there. So what do you do? Well, you just put a piece of sheet metal in there. It's a very low-tech solution, but it keeps your gas tank cool, or keeps the floorboards in your
If you
car
want it
cool.
really cold, put a second one in, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Just add another opaque object there to block the flow of radiation from one thing to the other.
So what do you think is the life expectancy of these 2 probes?
Well, the Parker Solar Probe has a limited lifetime, and again, I think it's this fall when it will have its last encounter.
It's the closest
with
approach
Venus.
is coming, yeah.
And then it will take its closest approaches, and I think at that point it will be in an orbit that will be the same for however long it lasts. And presumably at some point they will have collected all of the information that they desire from this. And then it will be just a matter of how long will things components last there. I think the solar wind and other things are affecting the probe. It is suffering impact damage from these things. And so it is degrading to some degree just by being close to the sun. But when that mission ends, I don't know. The Webb Space Telescope has to maintain this orbit, and I believe it has capability to adjust its position.
It does.
And so at some point it will run out of propellant, and its orbit will change. Perhaps its configuration with respect to the sun and all will change. But I'm sure its mission will last a number of years. And
yeah, the hope is 30.
30, okay.
Yeah, and they said if it lasts 10, it'll be worth it. But they're hoping, and that's what amazes me about these NASA space missions, is that these missions tend to last way longer than what they tell the taxpayer. So
yeah, the Pioneer and Voyager spacecraft.
They're still going.
They're out there. They're up, moving outside the solar system. And gosh, boy, I remember when the Webb Space Telescope was sent to its Lagrange point orbit. There was a lot of nervousness about will everything go right in deploying the segmented mirror and getting it into position.
It's incredibly complicated, and
because they realize there's no second chance with this. We cannot do a repair mission with this mission like we did with the Hubble Space Telescope.
Well, I noticed the Europeans have sent another spaceship to that same Lagrange point.
Oh, really?
So, yeah.
So it's going to get crowded there.
It might get crowded. I mean, it's a great place to do astronomy because you are far away from the heat of the sun, the moon, and the Earth. And, it's also a place where you get to observe 24 hours a day. People don't realize that you lose an hour a day with the Hubble Space Telescope.
Oh, wow.
But with James Webb, you get to go 24/7. So,
I'm in just my sweet spot for a teacher of heat transfer, and there are other interesting things about space too. The idea of putting, say, a nuclear power station in Earth orbit or a deep space mission to take advantage of this very wonderful heat sink that we have. One of the lessons we had last fall was talking about, well, how would you put a Rankine cycle heat engine in space, and at what temperature would you want to radiate?
I'm going to stop you. Rankine heat cycle. We all know what that is, but
Sure. Well, a steam power plant is basically operates on the Rankine cycle. You boil water at high pressure, and you put that through a turbine. You condense the water, reject the heat, and start the cycle all over again.
Start it all over again, right.
So there's been thought that if you put a molten salt reactor on a deep space mission, that would be an ideal heat source. And it would operate, say, with helium or CO2 or some other gas in probably a Brayton cycle, which is used for gas turbine engines. But then you reject the heat to space. And based upon thermodynamic principles, the higher the maximum temperature and the lower the minimum temperature indicates the more efficient the system
the more
would
work
be.
you can do with it.
And so because deep space is such a wonderful heat sink,
Because it's so cold.
The thought is, well, I can make it a super efficient heat engine. The issue there is how big does your radiator have to be? The radiation heat transfer is a function of the fourth power of the absolute temperatures. And so if you make if you want your heat sink to operate at a very low temperature, well, you need a really big radiator to do this. So somewhere between the high temperature in your molten salt reactor and the 3 Kelvin deep space would be the optimum temperature for your radiator.
But we're talking getting at least double the work out of an engine that you would here on Earth.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's the other interesting thing about teaching thermodynamics. When I was at the University of Maryland, most steam power plants at that time operated at about 30% thermal efficiency. There were some far out super critical plants that operated close to 40%. And yeah, there were gas turbine engines out there, but they weren't very efficient. They were used for peak loads. Nowadays, we use those gas turbine engines on the high temperature side, and we get thermal efficiencies over 60%. And my students may not appreciate that, but I sure do. When I was there in their position, 30% was doing really well, and now we're doing over 60%. That's just amazing to me.
But now you got to have stuff that's very heat tolerant to pull that off. Yeah.
And of course, the future of this is interesting because all of these combined cycle plants now operate with natural gas as their heat source, and we're moving closer and closer to operating those on hydrogen. So you could end up with as long as you have a hydrogen source, you could end up with a thermal power plant that produces no CO2 at all. But there are some engineering challenges to running a gas turbine on pure hydrogen. So.
Well, there's always engineering challenges, right? No matter what you do.
Job security for engineers, that's what I'm about.
Thermodynamics always gets in the way. But it's really fascinating what you're telling us about how do we overcome the thermodynamic limitations.
That's right. We haven't repealed the second law yet. But
no, we won't, but we can work with it and get more bang for the buck. So
the second law and entropy is a fascinating thing to teach too, because the idea that the disorder in the universe is something we can quantify. We know that your coffee cup does not gain heat from the room and make the room colder. We know that heat only flows from high temperatures to low temperatures, but putting numbers on that and quantifying it so that we can design things to optimize the efficiency is a fascinating
Well, one thing I
mathematical
put
trick.
on a test for my students, what's the most entropic system we know of? And the answer is the universe.
There you go.
There's nothing more entropic than the universe.
Yeah, we don't have an environment that we can reject heat to from that.
Yeah, so, well, this has been really good. And thank you for joining us today on Stars, Cells, and God. Join the discussion in the comments below. Remember to like this video and to subscribe for more content. New episodes of Stars, Cells, and God release each Wednesday and are available here on YouTube and on your favorite podcast app. Be sure to share this video with a friend, and remember, the more we know about science, the more reasons we have to believe in the Bible as God's inspired inerrant word and Jesus Christ as Creator, Lord, and Savior.